feeling distinct?
I'll just give a quick introduction. On my far right is Ty Galford from Indigenous Governance and the Department of Political Science. Next to him is Susan Streger from the School of Social Work. And then Joanne Lee from Department of Women's Studies. To my immediate right is Devor, who is a former Dean of Graduate Studies and from the Department of Sociology. It's very intimidating to be with this very strong group of activists who's had so much experience. Our title this afternoon is 50 Years of Activism, Rethinking Realities. Last night I briefly talked about what rethinking reality would mean, and I'd like to just go over that for some of you who were not there last night. The root word of reality is real, meaning tangible. It could be factual events that can be interpreted in so many ways, but who is to say that interpretation is correct, or that my interpretation is right and that yours is not? There are so many factors that contribute to how someone perceives reality. All the things that make the individual who they are, the stimuli they're exposed to, both internal and external, and the matrix they use to evaluate what they see, sense, use, or disregard adds to what reality is. Reality can be defined in a way that it links to worldviews or parts of them. Reality is the totality of all things, structures that are actual and conceptual, events that are past and present, phenomena, whether observable or not. This is an opportunity for us to rethink and to relook at realities and to hear the experiences of these four folks today. We're so privileged to be able to hear and to experience something that's happening and that's current today. So without further ado, we're doing this in alphabetical order by first names. So we'll start with Aaron.
My name starts with two A's, so I get to go first. All right, thank you, Grace. Good afternoon, everybody. I have been asked to talk about the alphabet group, LGBTQIAATT. There's a lot of letters. So you'll have to pardon me, I'm not going to be able to say all of those letters every time it comes up in what I have to say, but you can fill in the ones that you need to have there. We were asked to talk about 50 years of activism, and so where I thought I would start with was what was the world like in 1963 for people who fit in those groups? Or perhaps I should say people who might have fit into those groups, because some of those letters or names either didn't exist in common vocabulary or were understood quite differently. So for instance, at that point, queer was a very nasty thing to call somebody. And when you called somebody queer in 1963, you spit it out. And you said it as a real big insult. And people who live from that period of time, even today, sometimes have trouble hearing that word. What characterized that period of time was isolation, secrecy, and shame. We have gay pride marches, we have a pride organization, we do a lot of things today that we call pride. And I suspect that a lot of people who are engaged in pride activities have never stopped to think about, well, why that word in particular? And that word is the opposite of shame, because when it started being used for this part of the world, shame was the predominant feeling. So let me just take you back a little bit, and what I'm going to do is tell you about a few of the things that characterize that period of time. I was alive then, and I'm going to intersperse a few of my own memories with some more public events. And let me say that there's a T in that equation, and in 1952 there was someone named Christine Jorgensen who had a sex change, which is what they called it then, and her story was splashed across the newspapers all across the world. Other than that, which was big news at the time, nobody knew the word transsexual, the word transgender was not in existence, and by 1963, which was 50 years ago, most people, certainly young people, had never heard of her, because 10 years before was ancient history, and the adults absolutely never spoke about that in front of children. All right? So trans people were invisible. Someone earlier today, I think it was Susan, mentioned the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which is where physicians and psychiatrists turn to decide whether you're crazy or not. That existed in 1963, and trans people were so off the map that they weren't even in there. Gay people were, though, and being gay was considered a mental illness, and so just being gay was considered a mental illness. It was also a sin. Any religion would have told you it was sinful. You were going to hell or wherever your religion sent bad people. There were no gay churches, there were no gay organizations, there were no support groups, there were no gay-straight alliances. So it was one of the phrases we heard back then was a love that dared not speak its name, which is from a poem in the 19th century. I'm not an English major. There were no legal protections. It was against the law, all right? So, excuse me, in 1963 in Canada, the law had just recently changed so that it was simply illegal. However, just recently, in recent memory, that would have affected the way people thought and felt about being, I'm using gay or trans as the overarching terms. Just before that, you were called a criminal sexual psychopath for simply being gay. That was the legal classification, and it was improved upon by 1963. The legal designation had changed to dangerous sexual offender for any type of gay activity, for your simple existence. So try and imagine what it was like to be gay or trans in that period of time. You certainly couldn't announce it to anybody. You certainly did not introduce your boyfriend or your girlfriend. If you lived with somebody, you hid that fact. Nobody could know that. You could not express any affection in public. And when I say could not, what were the consequences? Well, there were no legal protections. You could lose your job. You probably would lose your job. You would be thrown out of your housing. Your name could be published in the newspaper and you would be permanently shamed and an outcast. The consequences were very serious. Gay bashing happened all the time. It wasn't against the law. The police would not protect you. They would not come to your rescue. You would go to the police and complain about it and they would beat you up. Or if you were a lesbian, perhaps rape you, right? It was a very, very harsh time. Let me tell you a story about Canada. In 1965, there was a man named Everett Klippert, K-L-I-P-P-E-R-T. He was being interviewed in the course of an investigation about an arson that happened. He was not a suspect. He was merely being interviewed in the course of an investigation, and he was asked, where were you at such and such a time? And he acknowledged to the police that he was with a boyfriend, and that he was homosexual, and that he was engaged in homosexual acts at that time. I guess he was a very brave man to say that. So what happened was that he was arrested for that, for having been engaged in homosexual acts. He was examined by a psychiatrist who determined that he was unlikely to stop having sex with men, that he really was gay, and he was designated as a dangerous sexual offender, and he was sentenced to life in prison in 1965 in Canada. He appealed his sentence. He was an activist. He appealed his sentence all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and his sentence was upheld, and he was left in jail. He was finally released in 1971 on parole. He was not acquitted. It was not overturned. He was released on parole because by that time, the law had changed in Canada. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the activism that in both of these groups, and I do not separate trans and gay, lesbian, etc. One of the earliest trans activists was a woman named Virginia Prince. You actually just saw her up on the screen a moment ago when you saw the homepage for the Transgender Archives. She started speaking out publicly in 1956 about trans activism, 1956 in the United States. And the reason she started doing that is she had been arrested for writing a sexually explicit letter to another trans person. And at that point, it was against the law to send obscene materials through the mail, and she was charged with a mail offense, postal offense. And convicted, her name was put in the paper, her marriage was ruined, her life was ruined. She was publicly shamed and humiliated. She started speaking publicly because her lawyer said, well, can she cross-dress for educational purposes? And the courts remarkably said yes. And so she became the first public activist for transgender. In Canada, activism started for gay people in 1964, as far as I could find in terms of public organized activism. The first gay organization was called ASK, A-S-K. They put out a couple of newsletters, also in 1964. 1967, things started to change in Canada. Pierre Trudeau, you may remember him, was the justice minister at the time. He became quite famous. He introduced a bill, C-150, which was meant to decriminalize homosexuality. You'll recall it was against the law, and Everett Clippett went to jail for life for being homosexual. And he had a very famous quote you may have heard: "The state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation." 1969, it was finally passed. So in May of 1969, homosexuality was no longer illegal. Social change takes a lot longer than that. It's very uneven, and it takes longer. Just because the law changed doesn't mean people stop discriminating. You may have noticed that people still kill people, and it's been against the law for a long time to commit murder. Right? So don't confuse legal change with social change. Right? Also in 1969, a very important event took place in the United States, in New York City, often referred to as Stonewall. And what Stonewall actually was a gay bar in Greenwich Village, where a lot of trans people who didn't use that term then, but looking backwards, we would call them trans people, drag queens and very, very, very masculine women, as well as everybody in between, spent a lot of time. And it was I can't remember if it was a mayor's race or a governor's race. It was a political race that was happening that encompassed New York. And as part of that, they were getting hard on vice, hard on crime. And the gay bars paid money to the mafia, and again, homosexuality was not yet legal. And so they went around to the bars and they raided the bars. And this one particular bar, this one particular night, they fought back. And it was mostly the trans folks, but everybody was out there. They started it, and then everybody got into it. For 6 days, the streets burned. The police had to lock themselves in the bar to protect themselves from all these gay people who were fighting back. That was what most people point to as the beginning of gay pride. The first gay pride marches started the following year. How am I doing? Who's keeping time? Nobody, okay.
No, Doris keeping time.
Okay. I was in New York at that time. I was underage for drinking, and I was in a gay bar that summer. And so I experienced what it was like to be in one of these raids. I was with a lesbian friend and a gay male friend. And we're in this place, and bars then, you know, you had to know where it was. There were no signs. You had to know somebody at the door. You often had to have a password to get in, because it was all completely illegal, right? So we're in this very secret place, and people are dancing, the music is happening, people are drinking, and all of a sudden it's dark because you don't want to be seen, you don't want anybody to know who you are except the person that you've chosen to disclose yourself to. All of a sudden, bright lights go on, and a big, heavy male voice goes, "Nobody move. This is a raid." And everybody is terrified. Terrified. And one by one, they photographed every person there. They took down everybody's name, everybody's address, and took them all out and put them in the paddy wagon. Right? I was the last one to leave. They knew I was very young. They didn't believe a word I told them about where I was from and who I was, and I'd left my ID in the car with my friend's car because I knew enough to not bring that in. And they told me they let me go because when they turned the lights on, the gay man and the lesbian I was with were dancing with each other. I was with the only two people of opposite sexes who were dancing with each other, and they thought probably this kid was in good hands. Maybe. But I was the last one out. I can't tell you how terrified I was, because I knew people who had been sent to mental hospitals for being underage and gay. I knew people who had had electric shock therapy for being underage and gay. And my friends could have been put in jail for life for corrupting my morals. Very, very scary time. All right, so Gay Pride starts, and we see all kinds of things happening. We see marches start to take place. I went to the first one in New York City. It was just an exhilarating, unbelievably high time. One of my favorite moments in there was a group marching with a big banner that said Queens Liberation Front. And it was a bunch of trans women, or drag queens as we called them then. And Queens, as some of you will know, is a borough of New York. So they were from Queens. They were the Queens Liberation Front, just great. In Canada, we started to see things happening in the early 70s. The very first gay rights protest happened on Parliament Hill. It was called We Demand. Body Politic started publishing in 1971, which is a very successful and long-running gay newspaper. Lots of history there, not enough time to tell you all of it. I was there, I'm getting close to you. I was there for starting that. Community Homophile Association of Toronto was one of the first organizations, also started in 1971. In Vancouver, Gay Alliance Towards Equality, called GATE, started there. Association of Canadian Transsexuals, 1971, so big turnaround time. 1973 was the first lesbian conference held in Canada. And for those of you who did not read my biography, I have to tell you I was a lesbian then. Right? And I was one of the people that organized that conference. And that was still, in 1973, a time when we could not do any publicity. We went around handheld flyers to the secret gay bars that you had to know the password to get in, and absolutely no media attention on this. It's a little bit of history is known, but not much because it was a big secret. All right, fast forward 50 years. Here we are today. There was a panel earlier today about does it get better? I would say in many ways it does, and in many ways the same problems are with us. Many people still live with secrecy, isolation, and shame. Gay bashing has not stopped. People are getting killed. But what has changed is social attitudes have changed tremendously. Have you been watching the news? There's a lesbian premier in Ontario just this week. The laws have changed. There's gay-straight alliances in the high schools. We're having these kinds of conferences. People can talk. And Grace just mentioned, I was the Dean of Grad Studies at UVic for 10 years. And everybody who put me there knew I was trans, all right? So things have changed and things have not changed. What do I want to see for the future? I want to see a world in which we actually go a little bit beyond what Olivia Barr was just talking about. I had a conversation a few years ago with a friend named Igor Khan, who was in the Russian Academy of Sciences and was one of the main people pushing for gay rights in Russia. And I said to him something about tolerance for us. And he said, no, you don't want tolerance. So then I said, oh, right, acceptance. And he said, no, you don't want acceptance either. What you want is indifference. You want it to not matter at all. Unless you're looking for a partner, and then it matters, all right? Personally, but socially, it should just be of no consequence, indifference. So I want to see a world where not only does your sexual orientation not make a difference in your social status, but where you can be any gender you want, any day you want. You can be this one today and that one tomorrow, and you can change from morning to afternoon to evening, and it's of no more consequence than your fashion statements. And that's the way gender is, and that is the social consequence. Maybe someone thinks you're dressing funny, okay, but that's not such a big deal, is it? All right, so I'm hopeful. I think things have changed. We have a long way left to go. We're not done yet.
We'll hold comments and questions after all the panelists have had a chance to speak.